So far in our study of argumentation, we have only studied simple arguments with single lines of reasoning. A line of reasoning is just a focused thread of support for a claim. So any idea that supports a claim, as well as the ideas that support that idea and the examples that support those ideas, that whole thread we call a line of reasoning. A line of reasoning is going to be made up of the claim plus at least one logical premise, and then however many supporting premises and examples that support that one first logical premise. For example, this very simple argument here has just one line of reasoning. Our claim is supported by a single premise. That premise is supported by a couple of examples, but we would call this whole thing, the premise and the two examples, that would be one line of reasoning. Of course, more sophisticated arguments, extended arguments within a lot of the texts we've read, they're going to feature more than just one line of reasoning. You're going to see multiple lines of reasoning where that primary claim is supported by multiple premises, and those multiple premises are themselves supported by more premises and by examples. So the map of an extended argument might look something like this. We've got our central claim here at the bottom, and then we've got 1, 2, 3 different lines of reasoning branching off supporting that claim. I color-coded them just to distinguish them. Our first line of reasoning is a single premise supported by a couple of examples. Our second line of reasoning is a premise supported itself by another premise, which is supported by a couple of examples. And then over here in purple, a premise supported by another premise illustrated by just one example. So there's a lot of different shapes that this can take, but at its heart, we need to understand that a primary claim in an extended argument is usually supported by multiple lines of reasoning. But before we get too far into the lesson, go ahead and pause this video rather, and reflect on the reflection question. Just write a paragraph, write informally and off the top of your head. So why are we studying this? Well, on the AP Lang exam, you'll need to be able to do a few things as far as identifying and analyzing argument structure goes. You'll need to be able to identify the different structures of simple and extended arguments. For instance, be able to tell us how many lines of reasoning and what those lines of reasoning are. You'll also need to explain how various sentences and whole paragraphs within a text function within the larger structure of extended arguments. So a question on the multiple choice section might ask you, in paragraph 4, how does it function relative to the argument as a whole, something like that. Lastly, on the Q1 and Q3 essays, you need to be able to write extended arguments in response to given topics that feature clear lines of reasoning. And because it is an essay that you're writing, it needs to be an extended argument, so you will have multiple lines of reasoning that you will need to argue. In order to do all this, in order to be successful either analyzing or writing arguments on the AP Lang exam, you must be able to understand how arguments are structured. Okay, you need to get comfortable with mapping them both physically and kind of briefly in your head. You also need to build the vocabulary necessary to talk about argument structure. So let's look now at some key terms that you need to be able to know in order to talk about argument structure. There are two different ways that a claim can be supported. Either through a premise, which is just a general idea stated as a truth that is used to support the claim, or through an example, which is a specific instance of something used to support a claim. The way that you can tell apart premises from examples is that premises rely on deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is the process of beginning with general ideas and from those following them to specific conclusions. Okay? For instance, in this short argument here, the houses in this neighborhood sell very quickly because of the excellent schools nearby and the convenience to shopping. Because of the excellent schools nearby and the convenience to shopping, those are two separate premises that support the claim that the houses in this neighborhood sell very quickly. We call them premises and not examples because they're not specific instances of something. They are just general statements of truth. And so if these statements are true, then they support our claim. Examples, on the other hand, rely on inductive reasoning, where you have specific instances that lead us to general conclusions about the larger group that you're trying to represent with those specific instances. For example, this is another simple argument. The houses in this neighborhood sell very quickly. A 3-bedroom on Marigold Street sold after just 4 days on the market, and a 4-bedroom over on Wheeler sold after just 36 hours. There, the claim is supported by a couple of different specific examples, specific instances of houses that did sell relatively quickly after being put on the market. So we would call these examples and not premises because they're specific instances and because they are demonstrating specific instances of what the claim is stating. Premises and examples provide two very necessary functions in arguments. Premises are used to argue how or why an idea is true, whereas examples are used to argue simply that an idea is true. Taking a look back at our first sample argument here, the houses in this neighborhood sell very quickly because of the excellent schools nearby and the convenience to shopping. Here, our evidence, the two premises, are giving two reasons why our claim is true. Yeah, why do the houses in this neighborhood sell quickly? Well, because of the excellent schools and because of the convenience to shopping. But looking at our second sample argument here, the houses in this neighborhood sell very quickly. A 3-bedroom on Marigold Street sold after just 4 days. A 4-bedroom on Wheeler sold after 36 hours. Here, our evidence, our couple of examples, are giving two reasons that the claim is true. Yeah, the houses on this neighborhood sell very quickly. For instance, the house on Marigold sold this fast. The house on Wheeler sold this fast. Those are each examples that demonstrate that this claim is true. An effective extended argument will use a combination of both premises and examples. You really can't just rely on one or the other. Your lines of reasoning, however, in an extended argument, those should always be headed by premises. And that's because if they're headed by specific examples, there's no really space, there's no room to go any further than that. You've already gotten as specific as you can, which usually means that you've kind of skipped some logical steps in between. So premises should always support your main or primary claim, and then those premises should be supported by additional premises and examples. If we were to combine the two arguments that we looked at together, it might look something like this. The houses in this neighborhood sell very quickly because there's convenient access to shopping, because there are excellent schools nearby. And then our two examples, I had to come up with a premise that they're supporting because there is recent history of houses in this neighborhood selling very quickly. And then that premise is supported by the two specific examples we've already looked at. If I wanted to flesh out this argument further, I would of course need to provide some specific, maybe some examples of that convenient shopping that's nearby, some examples of the excellent schools that are nearby. That kind of thing would help further flesh out this argument and strengthen it. Finally, just a note about thesis statements and your thesis. The thesis in an extended argument should be a combination of the primary claim that you have at the bottom of an argument map and the premises that lead off each line of reasoning. So for instance, the thesis of that argument that we just looked at would be something like this. The houses in this neighborhood sell very quickly because there is convenient access to shopping and excellent schools, and because there is a recent history of houses selling quickly. All right, it's time to begin our first exercise of this lesson. This time, you'll just need to pause the video for a short while to read the text. It's a text written by the New York Times editorial board back in 2004 titled "Felons and the Right to Vote." read that text and then unpause the video so that you can follow along with me as I map out the extended argument made in paragraphs 1 through 6. So it'd probably be a good idea to get out either paper if you like to map arguments on paper. I, however, would strongly urge you to go ahead and open up a document or a drawing rather in draw.io so that you can follow along exactly with how I do this. So pause to read the text and then unpause to follow along with me as I actually map out this argument along with you. All right, strap in everybody. We are going to map an entire extended argument here. Remember, argument mappings are one of the best ways to visualize how an argument is structured, how a particular claim is supported by various lines of reasoning, and they can get kind of extensive, and it can all look very complex in the end, but we're going to do it piece by piece by piece, and I'm going to show you a very methodical way of going through a longer extended argument and breaking it down and mapping the whole thing. So this is the text that we're dealing with, felons in the right to vote. The very first thing that we want to do with our argument map is identify the primary claim. That's the idea, the statement that's going to go at the very bottom of our argument map. It's going to be the first box that we add to an argument map. So the instructions tell us to just analyze the first 6 paragraphs. And usually the primary claim is going to come somewhere at the beginning. So if we read through this first paragraph here, about 4.7 million Americans, more than 2% of the adult population, are barred from voting because of a felony conviction. Denying the vote to ex-offenders is anti-democratic and undermines the nation's commitment to rehabilitating people who have paid their debt to society. Felon disenfranchisement laws have also have a sizable racial impact. 13% of black men have had their votes taken away, 7 times the national average. But even if it were acceptable as policy, denying felons the vote has been a disaster because of the chaotic and partisan way it has been carried out. Something jumps out at me about that last sentence there. It kind of sounds like a thesis statement, so I'll bet that's where our primary claim is going to be. So we're introduced to this idea of felon voting rights being taken away. And the final sentence concedes, even if this were acceptable as a policy, denying felons the vote has been a disaster because of the chaotic and partisan way it's been carried out. So I think that our primary claim is going to be this here. Yeah, there we go. Denying felons the vote has been a disaster. And reading through the rest of these, yeah, sure enough, the next 5 paragraphs all support that idea. They're all different ways in which denying felons the right to vote has been a, quote, disaster. So we're just going to come over here to my argument map page in draw.io. I've just kind of created a new drawing here, entitled it after the notes in the guided notes there, and I just created my first box with this primary claim: denying felons the right to vote has been a disaster. As you've learned about thesis statements in the past, when a thesis statement is written the right way, it should preview the various lines of reasoning that the text is going to use to support that primary claim. So here in our what we think might be the thesis statement, it says, because of the chaotic and because of the partisan way it has been carried out. Now I could go ahead and start mapping that out as those two items there being my 2 main premises leading to the primary claim. But I don't want to do that yet because I'm not 100% sure, first of all, what chaotic really means, because that's kind of a loosely interpreted sort of nebulous word there. I understand what they mean by partisan, and we'll get to that in a moment. But for now, I just want to keep those 2 things in mind, that might be sort of the way that this is organized around those 2 ideas there. So instead, the next thing that we need to do is we need to figure out what those premises actually are that are used to support that primary claim. And the best way to do that is just to go paragraph by paragraph through the rest of the argument. So we've already looked at this first paragraph here. That's kind of the introduction. That's where we got our primary claim. Let's look at this next paragraph here and see if we can see what kind of argument it's making. 35 states prohibit at least some people from voting after they have been released from prison. The rules about which felonies are covered and when the right to vote is restored vary widely from state to state and often defy logic. In 4 states, including New York, felons on parole cannot vote, but felons on probation can. In some states, felons must formally apply for a restoration of their voting rights, which state officials can grant or deny on the most arbitrary of grounds. So what is this paragraph arguing here? Well, it has a couple of stated claims. This first sentence is really just giving us background information, so we want to ignore that as part of the argument. It's just saying that these are the number of states that have these sort of laws prohibiting felons from voting. The claim really comes in the next sentence here. The rules about which felonies are covered and when the right to vote is restored vary widely from state to state and often defy logic. That is kind of our claim right there. We know that because these next couple of statements about in 4 states, including New York, and in other states, those are giving us examples that support this idea. So we're going to take that idea and we're going to paraphrase it down into a single statement, because there's actually several different ideas that are kind of covered here. Rules about which felonies are covered, rules about when the rights to voting is restored, they vary and they defy logic. Technically speaking, we could break that up into multiple claims because it is delivering multiple ideas there. It's saying different things about multiple things. But since this is all one paragraph, we want to focus on this as being one complete argument right here. So it needs just one specific claim. So we're going to take this statement and paraphrase it into one specific claim. So this is what I came up with here. Laws on felon voting are varied and illogical. Yeah, typically, again, that's technically making 2 separate claims, saying that they are varied, and it's also saying that they are illogical. But the way that paragraph is developed, it's really just treating these 2 ideas as the same, as one single idea. So I'm just going to add that as a box right there nearby the primary claim that I've established, and I'm going to color it green. And yeah, I'm just going to color code this paragraph to go along with it. That will help me kind of trace what I've done so far. All right, let's take a look at the next paragraph here. Florida may have changed the outcome of the 2000 presidential election when Secretary of State Katherine Harris oversaw a purge of suspended felons that removed an untold number of eligible voters from the rolls. This year, which would be 2004 is when this was written, this year state officials are conducting a new purge that may be just as flawed. They have developed a list of 47,000 voters who may be felons and have asked local officials to consider purging them. But the Miami Herald found that more than 21,000 of them may have been listed in error because their voting rights were restored by the state's clemency process. Last week, the state acknowledged that 16,000 of those on the list should be allowed to vote. So this paragraph is a little different than the previous one, whereas the previous paragraph kind of led off with a very specific claim. This paragraph doesn't. It just gives us a couple of really big examples. The example from the 2000 presidential election, and then this year, which is 2004 in terms of when they were writing this. So 2 big examples. So that happens sometimes with writing in the wild, right? Even professional writers like those at the New York Times don't always spell out their claims and evidence as neatly as they should. So what we have to do is kind of paraphrase what the claim is that they're actually making here. We have to do some interpreting. So let's do that. Let's paraphrase what the claim is that they're making that is supported by these 2 different examples. And this is what I came up with here, that laws on felon voting are abused to suppress non-felon voters. Because that's what those two arguments are actually illustrating, that these politicians, these lawmakers or election officials, to be more precise, in Florida, are actually abusing their laws against felon voting to disenfranchise legal eligible voters as a means of suppressing the vote, usually so that their party can stay in power, and so they'll try to target people that they think would not vote for their party. So the poor, ethnic minorities, and that sort of thing. So they're using those to suppress non-felon voters. Okay, so after color coding that next paragraph blue, just to keep my arguments and lines of reasoning straight, let's move on to paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4. Elections officials are also far too secretive about felon voting issues, which should be a matter of public record. When Miss Harris used inaccurate standards for purging voters, the public did not find out until it was too late. This year, the state tried to keep the 47,000 names on its list of possible felons secret, but fortunately a state court ruled this month that they should be open to scrutiny. All right, so we're back to normal here with the paragraph that leads off with the claim. Yeah, this very first clause. That is our claim. Elections officials are also far too secretive. We know that's the claim because the examples they give of Katherine Harris using secret standards for purging voters that weren't known until it was too late, until after the election, and this example from this year, the year 2004, of trying to keep the 47,000 names secret as well. So that is going to be our claim. We want to be careful, this dependent clause here, which should be a matter of public record, that's not our claim, because remember, our primary claim is just talking about how denying felons the vote has been a disaster. So we're talking about the past tense, maybe a little bit of the present, but mostly just the past. Whereas the should be a matter of public record, well, that's shifting to what should be in the future. So that's not going to be a supporting argument for what has happened in the past. So this first main clause here, that is going to be better off as our primary claim for this paragraph. And there we go. I've just added that in purple. I paraphrase. This is almost word for word from the passage. Election officials are secretive about felon voting rights. Back over here to the text page, I've color-coded paragraph 4 purple to match up with the box. Let's move on to paragraph 5. There is a stunning lack of information and transparency surrounding felon disenfranchisement across the country. The rules are often highly technical, and little effort is made to explain them to election officials or to the people affected. In New York, the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School found that local elections offices often did not understand the law, and some demanded that felons produce documents that do not exist. All right, so this is another paragraph that starts off with a claim. Yeah, there's a stunning lack of information and transparency surrounding felon voting. That is going to be my claim there, because the rest of this paragraph all shows ways in which there's no transparency. So I've just paraphrased that into a new box. I've colored red here. There is a lack of transparency surrounding felon voting rights. All right, so after color coding that paragraph red, it's time to look at paragraph 6, which is the last paragraph we're going to map. It says, too often felon voting is seen as a partisan issue. In state legislatures, it is usually Democrats who try to restore voting rights and Republicans who resist. Recently, Republicans and election officials in Missouri and South Dakota have raised questions about voter registration groups' employment of ex-felons, although they have every right to be involved in political activity. Yeah, they just can't vote. They can help register people to vote. Anyway, in Florida, the decision about whether a felon's right to vote will be restored lies with a panel made up of the governor and members of his cabinet. Some voting rights activists believe that Governor Jeb Bush has moved slowly and reinstated voting rights for few of the state's ex-felons, to help President Bush's re-election prospects. All right, so there's another paragraph with a claim that comes up here towards the beginning. Felon voting is seen as a partisan issue, and that's kind of what this paragraph is about, although this paragraph isn't proving the fact that some people see this as a partisan issue. It's arguing that this has become a partisan issue. So that's where we're going to really write it out. And there we go. Our final paragraph is in a box now. Felon voting has become a partisan issue. Okay, so what I have here is my primary claim and then some of the premises used to support that claim. For now, I just pulled the claim from each of the body paragraphs supporting that claim there. The next thing I need to do is actually a couple of different things. I need to make absolutely certain that this is in fact my primary claim, now that I know the ideas that the rest of the argument are now that I know what the supporting ideas are. I need to make sure that I'm fully articulating what the actual primary claim is. Then I need to arrange the whole thing in such a way that these premises are supporting the primary claim. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of look at my primary claim and really scrutinize it. Denying felons the right to vote has been a disaster. Is that idea supported by all 5 of these ideas? Well, yeah, it is. I think my issue here is the fact that disaster is a little bit of a vague term. If you think about it, disaster is kind of figurative here. And when we're analyzing an argument, we want everything to be literal. So let's change the wording up on this to make it a little more specific. So to do that, what are these 5 ideas really trying to prove? That the laws on felon voting are varied and illogical. They've been used to to suppress non-felon voters. The election officials use them to be secretive. There's this lack of transparency, and ultimately it's been used as this partisan issue. So how can we rearrange that? How can we find a better wording for our primary claim here? Well, unfortunately, I don't know that I can get too much more specific here, but I can be a little more precise. Since there's so many different ideas supporting this primary claim, I think we have to go with something like this. Denying felons the right to vote has been harmful to American society. Yeah, it's not any more specific than the other one, but it's not figurative. At least it's literal. We're saying that it is harmful to American society. Next, what I need to do is I need to figure out how these ideas, these premises, actually support my primary claim here. And to do that, I'm just going to kind of group them out based on whether they're kind of an independent reason or a cluster of reasons that kind of work together. So I'm just going to kind of go through them one at a time. So laws on felon voting are varied and illogical. That's kind of a reason all by itself. Like, it doesn't really go with any of these others. I'm just going to kind of move it separately over here. Next, laws on felon voting are abused to suppress non-felon voters. And election officials are secretive about felon voting rights. Well, you know what? This fact that they're secretive, that kind of goes along with how they abuse those felon voting laws. And if we look back at the paragraph here, we even see that paragraph 4 here says election officials are also far too secretive. That also is kind of acting as a transition from the previous paragraph. So remember how before we couldn't really find a stated claim in here? Well, I think it's because these 2 paragraphs are meant to be sort of governed by the same idea. So let's kind of cluster those 2 together. Yeah, we'll just put them over here. And to make myself room, I'm going to scoot the whole thing over. And there we go. Next, there's a lack of transparency surrounding voting rights. Yeah, that is sort of related to this element of secrecy, but it's not quite the same thing because it's all about how people, like honest people, don't know how to interpret them. Whereas these 2 have to do with deliberate dishonesty, right? And then lastly, felon voting has become a partisan issue. It kind of goes along with these two here because it's definitely one particular party that has been guilty of doing this. But since it's a whole other paragraph, like separated by paragraph 5 here, I'm going to make it its own line of reasoning. Yeah, and especially because if we recall, this thing that we thought was our thesis statement kind of had two supporting ideas, that it's chaotic and that it's partisan. And so political partisanship, definitely seems like one of those supporting lines of reasoning. Okay, so now that I have all of these grouped out into what looks right now like 4 different lines of reasoning, I need to actually arrange them in a true argument map. That means I need to connect them to the primary claim with those downward pointing arrows. Now, for those of you who haven't used draw.io very much, there's a very simple way to connect ideas together. The best way I've found is if you just sort of highlight around the edges, you'll see little green nodes appear, and you can just kind of click on those to connect those to other nodes in other boxes. And what that does is it makes those 2 boxes now are connected, so you can move this around anywhere and the arrow stays. But I'm going to keep it right here for now. Bring this one down. And make another connection. Really doesn't matter which node as long as it's pointing to this particular box here. And to fast forward just a little bit, here is what it looks like when I'm done planning out the initial lines, or mapping out rather the initial lines of reasoning. Note what I did with our 2 sort of combined paragraphs here. Since they're both working together to support an idea, I went ahead and left that as a blank box because I need to figure out what that supporting idea is. So let's come up with that now. So, if I know that one paragraph is arguing that laws on felon voting are abused to suppress non-felon voters, another paragraph is arguing election officials are secretive about felon voting rights, because of this and because of this, therefore what? There we go. I think that is going to be the best way to phrase this. So, because laws on felon voting are abused and because election officials are secretive about it, therefore, elections officials have enforced felon voting laws unjustly. So now that I've come up with that sort of implied claim that those 2 paragraphs are making, I went ahead and colored the whole thing blue just because this is now one line of reasoning. So I'm going to go back here and color this purple paragraph blue just to keep my reasoning straight. So now, here we go. I've got 4 separate lines of reasoning all supporting that idea. Here we go, 4 separate premises stemming off of my primary claim, all pointing down to it because they support this primary claim. So this represents the basic structure of our argument, our primary claim and our the beginnings of our 4 lines of reasoning. What we need to do next to keep working on our map is to go into each one of these lines of reasoning, back to each one of those paragraphs, and to flesh out the actual premises and examples used to support each of these claims here. So let's start with that green paragraph, paragraph 2. And looking back at the paragraph, we see that this is mostly example evidence to support our claim that laws on felon voting are varied and illogical. So let's just build out the rest of this claim right here. And this is what that might look like. Yeah, laws on felon voting are varied and illogical. For example, in New York and 4 other states, felons on probation can vote. In New York and 4 other states, felons on parole cannot vote. I could have maybe put those in the same box, but it makes just as much sense to put them in separate boxes. Also, in some states, felons are only granted voting rights back based on arbitrary decisions by state officials. So I just paraphrased the 3 or 2, depending on how you look at it, examples supporting that idea. All right, next up, let's look at our blue paragraphs here. This is our other line of reasoning. And right away, we can tell this is going to be a little more complex, a few more boxes rather to elaborate on here. And that's because this idea that elections officials have enforced felon voting laws unjustly is already supported by a couple of examples here. That laws on felon voting are abused, and that election officials are secretive. So going back to the paragraph, we can pull out the specific examples that are used to support those two ideas. And this is what we come up with. If you recall, when we read that paragraph, each one had two big examples, and they were both similar examples. So the examples supporting that laws on felon voting are abused to suppress non-felon voters, we've got that example of Secretary of State Katherine Harris back in 2000, and then Florida officials in the year 2004. And the same sort of thing over here. Election officials are secretive. We've got that example of Katherine Harris keeping her methods secret back in 2000, and the Florida officials in 2004 doing the same sort of thing. All right, moving on to our red paragraph here. Yeah, the claim was there's a lack of transparency surrounding felon voting rights. Looking back through the paragraph, we can figure out there's a couple of premises supporting that idea, and then a couple of specific examples supporting one of those premises, which would look something like this. Yeah, so supporting our claim there that there's a lack of transparency. For one, the rules for restoring felon voting rights are often highly technical, and unfortunately the paragraph doesn't give us any examples of those technical rules. It's kind of implied in the rest of our examples, but it would be nice if they had given us specific examples. But that shows you even the New York Times, they're not perfect. And then over here, the people involved, meaning the elections officials and the ex-felons themselves, don't often understand the rules. And for that, we're given a couple of examples from the Brennan Center for Justice, found that many local elections officials did not understand the felon voting laws, and they also found that some local elections officials were requiring ex-felons to produce documents that did not exist in order to restore their voting rights. So that's kind of a silly example there, just to show you how extremely ridiculously kind of non-transparent these rules are. And finally, we come to our yellow paragraph here. The longest single paragraph, probably not the longest argument, maybe blue is, but here we go. Talking about partisan, how felon voting rights has become a partisan issue. Gives us a couple of premises from that. It's usually Democrats who are trying to restore voting rights, usually Republicans who resist. So that's going to be kind of the two premises supporting our claim here. Yeah, there we go right there, that Democrats usually support measures, Republicans usually are against it, and then it gives 3 or 2, depending on how you look at it, different examples of how Republicans are resisting or just generally opposed to restoring felon voting rights. The examples of Republicans in both Missouri and North Dakota who are for some reason attacking voter registration groups just for employing ex-felons, even though that has nothing to do with the laws prohibiting them from actually voting. And then this example here about Jeb Bush back in 2004 being accused of intentionally slowing down the review process for restoring the voting rights of ex-felons, so that fewer ex-felons would be getting the rights to write their voting rights back, so that he could ultimately help his good cousin George win the election. So all examples of how felon voting has become this partisan sort of weapon. So at this point, I have all of my individual lines of reasoning mapped out. Yeah, I've covered all 4 of my lines of reasoning here. Now the fun part begins. We need to piece all 4 of these lines of reasoning back together into one connected argument map. And after some finagling here of moving things back and forth, I was finally able to fit it all into one nice map. It's kind of hard to see on the screen all at one time, but you'll see that each of those lines of reasoning all connect back to that primary claim that we established. I'll zoom out here so we can see it. Yeah, there's the whole thing right there. And that's what an argument map should look like, with various levels of, or excuse me, with various lines of reasoning extending out from the claim, all pointing down to it because they're supporting that claim. All right, now that we've completed that argument map, let's answer some analysis questions on the arguments made in this text. Go ahead and pause this video, respond to the questions that you're given, just using 1 or 2 complete sentences for each. Okay, number 1, based on the argument that we mapped, what is the writer's thesis? Well, for that, we just kind of need to piece together the claim at the bottom and all 4 of the premises supporting it. So the thesis would be something like this. Denying felons the right to vote has been harmful to American society in that the laws on felon voting are varied and illogical. The laws have been enforced unjustly by election officials. The laws lack transparency, and the laws have become a politically partisan weapon. Number 2, what 4 lines of reasoning do the writers structure their argument around? Hopefully that's pretty clear to you by now. They're color-coded on the argument map we did together. The first line of reasoning is that laws on felon voting are varied and illogical. The second one argues that election officials have enforced felon voting laws unjustly. The third argues that there's this lack of transparency surrounding felon voting laws. And lastly, the fourth one argues that felon voting has become a partisan issue. And number 3, what is the big shift that occurs after paragraph 6? In other words, how does the writer's argument change starting in paragraph 7? Well, we only analyzed 1 through 6 for a reason. That's because that is one complete argument. Paragraph 7 kind of takes this text in a new direction, or a related direction, not a completely new direction. But it starts off with saying the treatment of former felons in the electoral system cries out for reform. The cleanest and fairest approach would be simply to remove the prohibitions on felon voting. So here we see a shift from what the problems have been in the past to what ought to be done in the future. So the shift that occurs is from all of the from an argument and evidence that argues how disastrous felon voting laws and restoring felon voting rights has been in the past. Now we shift to the second half, which is arguing what should be done in the future to fix this problem. Okay, moving on to number 4. What is the function of paragraph 8 within the second half of the text? Well, let's take a look. Paragraph 8 starts with restoring the vote to felons is difficult because it must be done state by state and because ex-convicts do not have much of a political lobby. So the previous paragraph, paragraph 7, announced that something clearly needs to be done to fix these issues of restoring felon voting rights, and it acknowledges that the easiest thing, or the most complete way, would just be to eliminate all laws that bar ex-felons from voting. Paragraph 8, though, kind of qualifies that by saying that doing this would be incredibly difficult because it would have to be done on a state-by-state level. So the function of paragraph 8 is to kind of qualify or limit the argument that was started in paragraph 7. And as we see, the remaining paragraphs, 9 through the end, all kind of operate under that assumption that we can't just wipe away the laws as cleanly as we'd like to do. We have to instead acknowledge the difficulty and take smaller baby steps. And that leads us to number 5. I kind of just explained it. How do the ideas in paragraphs 9 through 11 build off the argument made in paragraph 8? Well, paragraph 8, of course, explains how difficult this is going to be and how we're going to have to take these baby steps and have to accept what we can do in the meantime. And that's what paragraphs 9 through 11 do. They explain all of the little things that can be done in the meantime, ultimately with the goal of eliminating these laws that bar ex-felons from voting. And that brings us to number 6. What do the writers imply ought to be done about felon voting rights, and how does this differ from what the writers actually state that people in power should do? So looking at just the second half, we can see that the writers of this argument clearly believe that ex-felons deserve the right to vote, and that all laws barring them from voting should be ultimately eliminated. However, the actual suggestions that they make in the second half acknowledge the difficulty of the issue, and instead they merely argue that voting rights should not be a political football. It shouldn't be partisan. Instead, both sides, Democrat and Republican, should work together to support efforts to help ex-felons get their voting rights back. So that is kind of what should be done in the immediate sense, while the writers want a much larger goal to be accomplished. All right, that's the end of this interactive lesson. Time to move on to that practice activity. You're going to be reading another text about the same length and mapping another extended argument about the same length. I think the argument map here isn't going to be quite as big. You won't have 4 full different lines of reasoning. I believe this one's just going to have a couple of lines of reasoning. But you want to read the entire essay. Make sure you only map the argument that's presented across paragraphs 4 through 12. Okay, then go ahead and respond to the study questions that follow, again, using just 1 or 2 complete sentences each.